Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respects to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Today, City Lights and Synergetic Press present Justice Rivera discussing their new book, Body Autonomy, Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use. It's published by our friends at Synergetic Press. We will have guest appearances by the Body Autonomy contributors, Ismail Lourido Ali and Paula Kahn. At a time when a privileged class can publicly embrace the benefits of psychedelics and sex positivity, marginalized communities continue to experience repression and brutality, as is seen in everything from healthcare inequities to overdose deaths. In Body Autonomy, leading advocates, sex workers, and scholars who have experienced firsthand the inequities of American neocolonial policies level a powerful critique and explore the ideological wars on body autonomy and map the tactics from the war on drugs onto legislation that criminalizes and disenfranchises sex work. This is a courageous and timely collection that arrives at a crucial moment when it becomes vital to defend the right to freedom in one's own body. Body Autonomy explores healing-centered harm reduction practices to offer us a path beyond punishment and iniquity and move forwards towards liberation. Justice Rivera is a writer, social justice consultant, harm reductionist, and pleasure activist based between San Juan and Seattle. Justice's professional and artistic work is grounded in the principles of harm reduction, anti-oppression, and healing justice. Justice has worked to provide direct services, organizing leadership, and capacity building support to people in the sex trade, survivors of trafficking, and people who use drugs around the country. She's now a partner with the QPOC-led harm reduction consulting company Reframe Health and Justice. This anthology was compiled in part through her 2019 Open Society Foundation Soros Justice Media Fellowship. So joining her today will be Ismail Lourido Ali, the co-author of Drug Policy to Break Intergenerational Curses. Ismail is the Director of Policy at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as well as founding board member of the Psychedelic Bar Association. He currently serves on the board of directors for SAGE Institute and has previously served as chair of the board of directors for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. He is also part of Chacruna Institute's Council for the Protection of Sacred Plants and on the advisory council for the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. Also with us will be Paula Kahn. Paula Kahn is the co-author of Drug Policy to Break Intergenerational Curses. An artist, movement strategist, and MPH candidate, Paula works at the intersection of Indigenous rights, racial, migrant, and environmental healing justice, drug policy, feminism, historical memory, and decarceration and demilitarization. We were going to have Aya Tasaki with us. Sadly and regretfully, due to a family emergency, they could not be with us today, but we do have a full program. It is such a great pleasure to be able to welcome you here, and an honor as well. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, City Lights, for hosting this event. We're really just so honored to be here with you. And thank you also to our publisher, Synergetic Press, who's here with us today as well, for helping to coordinate this. Peter, are you sharing my slides or am I sharing my slides?
So yeah, let me activate your ability to do that. And you should be able to do that right now.
Awesome. All right, everyone. So if you just give me one moment, I'm going to share my slides if I can find them. Interesting. Hold on one second. Tech problems abound. We're going to try to find them. I'm not actually sure how to go into slide deck view here, but that's okay. I'm going to just share them like this. So you can go ahead and just see something here. Please ignore all of my open tabs.
You should be able to
Feel free
hit
share
present in
it.
the top right, and I think that'll do the trick.
Oh, cool. Okay, it's just that this. Oh, there we go. Share. Perfect.
No, present right next
Oh,
to it.
present. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be discussing our anthology, our wonderful, I think, paradigm shifting collection with you all. And I'm really grateful to be here with Izzy, and Paula might be joining us in a little bit today. I'll say that this is 3 to 4 of about 16 to 20 different contributors, 16 authors, and 4 other community-based contributors who did everything from editing to formatting. And so this was really a community-oriented project that I'm really proud of. And I think that everyone who is a part of it is just really amazing and does really amazing work, from folks who are activists to writers to healers to social service providers. Really an awesome eclectic group of folks who are working across a continuum of bodily autonomy. And so today, some of what I thought we could talk about is just meeting the contributors. I'll also read a little bit from the introduction of Body Autonomy to talk about what the genesis of the book is and some of what it's about. And then we're going to get into a conversation, because this event was called Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use, and really just talking about what does that mean? What does that look like in all of the contexts through which we're working? And then some options for being able to buy the book or support and engage the book from here on out. And we could potentially have time for questions too, if that's something that's in the book. So to start, I'd love to talk a little bit about the book. And actually, let me read from, I'm going to read from the introduction to start, and then talk about the table of contents, so you know everything that's between these pages. So this is from the introduction. The mainstream media, heavily influenced by police, prosecutors, and carceral feminists, tells us that the presence of the sex trade causes exploitation and is, in and of itself, exploitative. It cites the demand for sex and sex buyers as the problem. Their solution is to increase penalties and policing of men, largely men of color, who buy or purvey sex, thereby regaining power, filling jail and prison beds, and refinancing criminal legal system budgets that have been reduced from drug policy reform gains. This carceral approach to the sex trade, disguised as a war on sex trafficking, not only has devastating impacts on marginalized communities, but is also rooted in capitalist principles that ignore the daily realities of people in the sex trade. Criminalization effectively creates an underground criminal market, which in turn lends itself to exploitation through the prison industrial complex. In The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander highlights how language in the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution continues the legacy of antebellum slavery using prison labor, the war on drugs, and similar criminal legal crusades. The current US strategy to reduce exploitation is exploitative, and it is harmful. The irony is that it harms those that it ostensibly seeks to protect. In this anthology, I seek to engage others who have come to a similar understanding of the ways that pervasive drug war tactics are being used to further surveil and control marginalized populations through the war on sex trafficking. These wars on bodily autonomy are rooted in the gendered, racial, and economic biases encoded in our country's DNA, supported by a constitution that has never evolved in a meaningful way. And then skipping ahead a couple pages. What does it mean to heal? What do we need to heal? Healing, recovery, and expanding are incredibly personal. There is no one cookie-cutter way to heal. Healing is also political. Communities of color hid or buried traditional cultural healing modalities for centuries to minimize the ways in which colonial interests weaponize and or appropriate indigenous healing methods. How we are allowed to heal and what good healing looks like continues to be literally prescribed by people with the most power and privilege, determining which forms of healing are legitimate and who gets access to them. This book unpacks what it means to heal in America through the lens of healing justice, a liberatory approach that asks us to center individual and collective healing in our fights for survival, freedom, and restitution. I offer the contents of this book to those who are ready to complicate their understanding of surviving and healing, and to everyone who knows that punishment doesn't lead to liberation and wants something different, but might not know where to start or how to continue or where to end. And so as that introduction explicates, I wanted to start this project, this anthology, which is actually a two-part project for me. I kind of missed the market because I set to write a narrative nonfiction and then decided that's boring, although that's where the market's at right now, personally. I find it a bit boring. And so I wrote a memoir and then an anthology that had all of the educational pieces that the narrative nonfiction that became the memoir would have had. And I also knew that my story is just one story and my voice is just one voice, and that it would be so much more powerful to bring in other voices who are working in many different contexts to advance bodily autonomy, to advance compassionate approaches to community care, and instead of punishment. And one of the things that I think that ended up looking like for us is that we're an entirely BIPOC created collection, which I'm really proud of. And I think is really important in considering, you know, the publishing market and the other titles that are out that explore these topics. And one of the things that I've been seeing as someone who's been working with sex workers and with survivors of violence and trafficking for many years is that as we pull back and as we start to have some drug policy reform gains and we're able to address over policing or police brutality or you know, mass incarceration in particular ways, that just like that introduction said, we're using those same drug war tactics in other places that are attacking bodily autonomy, and we're basically playing ideological or whack-a-mole. And if we look at the table of contents here, the first part of this is Wars on Body Autonomy, and that third article, Wars on Bodily Autonomy, a Timeline, actually takes and juxtaposes all of the laws and the criminalization and the actions that have been criminalizing drug use and sex work and reproductive rights and LGBTQ identity at the same time. And you can really see that when one ceases to have utility, another one is used. And a lot of what that looks like is that it is a form of racialized control, and we can see the root of that. And this is how this is all playing out. And I think one of the reasons why that's really important, why this history really has such a huge impact on what it is we're doing today, is that our advocacy, our policy reform, the things we're pushing for, ultimately needs to be a lot bigger. And that's why a body autonomy framework is so important to me, is that all of our survival is intrinsically linked, and therefore our liberation is as well. And that's something that this book really seeks to do. And it moves from very tangible and tactical, talking about ways that people can increase safety in their life. So if we're looking at reframing harmful stigmas and harm reduction toolkits, which are part 2 and 3 of our books, that's exactly what that is. That's talking about what harm reduction in the sex trade that looks like. That's talking about what its stimulant stigma looks like when we are addressing an opioid crisis, and we, you know, are basically taking resources from one area and putting it towards another. And then we move towards more visionary and liberatory. And part 4 is my favorite because it's really that. And I'm excited that Izzy, whose article is in that section, is here to talk with you all today. I also like to joke that it's my favorite because I didn't write anything in it. So it was really just an amazing section. And so that's how our book really moves. And that's one of the things that I think is really important, is to have those tangible pieces along with the theory and the you know, the approach and the application. So I feel like I've talked enough here. So I'm excited to introduce some of the other authors who are here with us today. I think I saw that Paula is in the waiting room too. So just want to Just want to flag that because she could join us here. But first, Izzy, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear about you, your contribution to body autonomy. And then after that, we'll jump into this first discussion of what body autonomy means to us.
Sweet. Okay. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Looks like we're good. Awesome, awesome. First off, thank you so much, Synergetic Press, City Lights, the whole crew for helping both with the book, putting this event on, and just generally creating a platform for stories like this and conversations like this to be had. It's really meaningful in an environment where we're all sort of sorting through like what's real, what information can we rely on, what exactly is going on out here to just like have the space for conversations like this, edgy ones, interesting ones. So just really grateful for that as an initial kind of starting point. Thank you also, Justice, for the invitation to participate in this conversation. Hi, Paula, good to see you. I can maybe share a few words initially about like my perspective on the kind of origin story of this piece and of the chapter that Paula and I got a chance to co-write together, drug policy for bridging intergenerational curses, and get into a little bit how that fits into the larger theme, and then I'll hand it over for more discussion. So a couple initial thoughts at the time, just for background. I mean, Justice and I met each other, I think, about 7 years ago at a drug policy conference that was actually about stimulant users. And to the point you kind of just dropped in your intro, Justice, there has rightfully been a lot of attention on the opioid crisis and the many shades of it, whether it's overdose, dependency, the lack of social services, the kind of causal factors that led to that, to the current kind of social cultural outcome that we're still trying to navigate. And that conversation was, I think, in some ways ahead of its time that we met at, because it was tracking the fact that while it is really important that there is a real evidence-based, tactical, I guess you could say, conversation about how to navigate the at that time more emerging and now like kind of full-fledged crisis with respect to how opioids are used and managed in larger society and from a public health perspective, that there was this other whole side of it, which included these other classes of also highly stigmatized drugs. And just I bring that up because I feel like it's actually quite a good case study. That event was hosted by Drug Policy Alliance, and I really appreciated it because it's easy when we're navigating the like complex social reality that we are living in, to allow the kind of reductionism of the platforms that we have, whether they're social media or other things, to kind of focus our attention toward one thing at a time. And like, God knows there's enough things to focus on that, like, I get it. It makes a lot of sense to, when trying to problem solve or manage a dilemma, to focus on one thing at a time. And I think one of the invitations that was given to us in this, the writing and the supporting of this anthology, is to keep the aperture wide and to give, and kind of, I think, Justice, you sort of gave us as authors, as contributors, a chance to spread out as much as we wanted. And it's funny because, like, if you look at like academic conversations and conversations in kind of more focused news media, there's a reason why you have one topic at a time. The public has a very short attention span. I mean, I have a short attention span half the time. So like, I really understand that tendency. And also, I think that I want to start with that piece because the opportunity and invitation to look at a lot of issues at the same time through a very wide lens of history, is unique, or at least much less, much harder to find in today's kind of media environment. So that is one, I think, big piece about this compilation and this anthology that I really appreciated, both when we were drafting it as well as just now, a couple of years later, like looking at it in the context of the larger media landscape. And then getting just a brief couple thoughts on the kind of themes specifically. I mean, as folks heard in my intro, have been working in drug policy and specifically focusing on psychedelics, but in general, non-ordinary states of consciousness and the policy that we use to navigate that, for quite some time. And it's interesting that through the years of work I've been in it professionally, this conversation of bodily autonomy comes up in very specific contexts. In the United States, often in more of like a libertarian body sovereignty context, which is like the term used, I won't go into all the weeds of it now, but the term used in the law is sumptuary laws. They're laws that have to do with what you can consume and what you can put in your body and what's permitted and what has to be regulated and so on. So like you can buy laundry detergent that is not good to put in your body, but it has a label that probably says on there, not for human consumption or something like that, right? There's a certain way that we've managed the fact that there are toxic and dangerous things everywhere. I can't like eat the computer chips in my laptop or this or that. So I just say that to say that like we as a society have decided that it is not only possible, but maybe even necessary to have around us substances or specific things um, that are not necessarily safe for us in every single format. But yet we manage that. And then bringing that reality to the conversation about drugs, which also all have risks, all do have harms, all may have potential dangers, but treating those as if the way to regulate them is by banning them and preventing them and kind of prohibiting them and then criminalizing them puts us into this interesting category where they, like other substances, have risks or need to be treated in a certain way, need to be treated with a certain level of reverence or so on, or a level of responsibility. But because of their kind of placement in the larger social order, which goes into the history of relationships between certain social groups and certain geographic places and the substances themselves, geopolitical relationships between the production countries and the consumer countries of different drugs in different contexts. We get into this environment where society has kind of decided that that prohibition and unlike every other substance, every other thing that has risk, scuba diving, mountain climbing, bleach, whatever, all this other stuff, this like keyboard duster that you use, you know, to clean your computer off, all these things that like we have to figure out how to manage responsibly as adults in the world are different than these other categories of things. So I just want to make this connection where there's these two elements. One is like, well, what do we and do we not get to do with our bodies and put in our bodies? That's sort of an inward to outward facing question. And then this outward to inward facing question, which is like, there are dangerous and risky things all around us. What does that mean for us as people? How do we navigate that responsibly? How do we navigate that in the world where there's like children and where there are pets and where there are people who are vulnerable to their own, you know, because of trauma, because of the history, because of this or that, to different outcomes with those substances. So I know I'm keeping it a bit kind of more general at this point, but it's because I really want to keep this thread of like, what is the relationship between this conversation around bodily autonomy and then drug policy, and then like how those things are threaded, which is really what the chapter that Paula and I drafted together is about, in lots more detail than what I'm sharing here, with a little bit more magic sprinkled in. And maybe with that, I'll pass it to back to you, Justice, or to Paula to kind of give a few more thoughts on the chapter, the concept, the book, and so on. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Izzy. And Paula, you joined us actually right at introduction, so good timing. So I'd love for you to say whatever you'd like to say about yourself and the chapter and body autonomy as a project or a concept to you. I think that, oh, good, you can be unmuted.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paula. My pronouns are she, they. I'm situated here in Tataviam territory in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And I co-wrote the chapter breaking, I forget exactly, breaking intergenerational curses. It's a long-winded one, but yeah, basically we were conjuring and envisioning policy to address multiple generations and centuries of social control. And I really love that we were invited to contribute to this visionary anthology, because I think what it really brings together are people who are resisting the ideological wars that have been waged between human societies and civilizations to try to impose domination and subordination as a way that we relate to each other, as a way we relate to our ecosystems, as a way that we relate to knowledge production, what is valid, and how we should be living. And I think given where we're at today, I really look to this anthology to continue to guide us, because I think in the world of drug policy, of harm reduction, human mobility, sexual diversity and expression, we're going to have a lot of challenges that are going to be lined up. They're going to be stacked up. So I think this was like, I feel so proud to have contributed to a book that if it isn't already, it's probably like one of those books that could get banned, would be banned. And it's just, I feel really proud. Something that I feel really grateful for. It was one of my first times collaborating with a friend and writing a whole chapter and going through that iterative process of exchanging ideas and talking about what we wanted to emphasize, and going through the editing process multiple times and finding the time for that. So just a very beautiful experience. And it just makes me want to put together more anthologies with friends as we continue to engage in acts of resistance. This has been a really wonderful project that has been very enriching and has brought people together from different territories and very different walks of life, diverse walks of life. Something that I've recently done that is a continuation of this prayer. We open up our chapter with a prayer, but for me, it's really important to understand that the wars on bodily autonomy are so intimately related with those colonial encounters of identifying these cash crops, these raw materials that were then mass produced under enslavement, under context of enslavement and extreme labor exploitation, and just taking the moment to acknowledge that it was because so many indigenous people in the New World in Hispaniola, and so many of them were dying at high rates from the enslavement, the trauma, the extreme labor extraction, that then European colonizers then turned to Africa to turn to African peoples, believing that they would be able to sustain that extreme trauma to the body in a more resilient way than indigenous people that were in the New World. And then this new approach to maximizing profit out of the environment and out of human beings. And that's where a lot of this modern day policy and law and impunity comes from. And so thinking a lot about how to continue operating when there's so much impunity and so many attacks on our body autonomy. But I think writing sometimes when we can't be heard, we leave our marks through writing, and we connect, we exchange ideas. And so, yeah, the work continues, and just a big prayer that our explorations of psychoactive substances can offer breakthroughs for people that are very spiritually, ethically disoriented in these times. So, yeah, just hoping that awakenings are not banned as wokeness, and just very curious to continue relating to you all and continue exploring and resisting, and providing avenues for embodied emancipation for folks to understand that sexuality is a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual experience. It should be empowering. It doesn't have to be this thing that is feared or immoralized. Like, it shouldn't be casted as something immoral. And what we have had our ecosystem and the way humans have related to their ecosystems and found ways across time have had evolutions in how they relate to their ecosystems, and have developed ceremonies and spiritual technologies to experience gratitude and to learn from the environment. I just hope that humans can return to that in the most gentle ways as possible, rather than confrontational ways. But I'll turn it back to Justice and the crew here.
Thank you, Paula. I actually want to point to a couple articles that explore some of what you mentioned. So the first is by Melody Garcia, called "Fuck Myself into Heaven." And that one explores her relationship with polyamory and with becoming a sex worker, and how that was a really sacred experience to her, and how she believes that the work that she does is healing work. And that's really beautiful. And then the second is by Presto Cresto, who wrote an article called Black Trans Joy, a love letter to Poppy. And that one I actually really loved, because I put out on all my social media channels, and I said, you know, I'm really looking for an article that can talk about how we can reclaim a orientation of pleasure to our advocacy around substance use, instead of always having to go through this medical model, right? And a lot of what we see is, especially for me, I've done a lot of like opiate and stimulant harm reduction work, and we see that there is this narrative that really works, you know, especially in terms of policy reform, that is some people's narrative, definitely, right? That people started using opiates to, you know, as prescribed to support them around a surgery. And then when they weren't able to access those anymore, they ended up going to heroin or underground markets to find what they need. And I think that that is absolutely viable, right? Is that we need medical access more for people. And there is another avenue through which people are using substances, which is because it feels good or it helps them survive. And there are other approaches that really sometimes aren't as palatable, especially for policy reform or something like that. And so I was looking for someone to write about that, and I thought for sure people were gonna, I mean, and I did get some people writing about psychedelics, but I thought for sure, right, there's psychedelics are a lot of the pathway for being able to do this. And I think one of the beautiful things about Presto's article is it's actually about how poppy and opium helped him find gender euphoria instead of having moved through gender dysphoria, and how that pleasure was something that really supported his healing process and him figuring out who he was. So I just wanted to talk about how everything you're saying, right, has so much more in our anthology that can be explicated on. And I think between the three of us, we've noted how colonization and imperialism and slavery have deeply impacted our current approaches and our current relationships to substances and to sexuality and to labor. I'd really love to know from both of you, either, you know, what your article says or some of the things that you've been finding in your own life or communities. How are ways that we can start to decolonize our approach to substances and decolonize our sexualities in your own personal lives or in your communities?
Paula, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I can go, unless
Okay.
you want to.
No,
I
please,
was
please,
having
please.
trouble
Start
unmuting
us off, and
myself.
then I'm happy to respond. Yeah.
Yeah, let's see. Well, um, something I've been thinking about a lot. I had the opportunity to travel to Cali, Colombia for the Conference of the Parties, the 16th Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity. And a big takeaway for me is this process of reckoning that the coca plant is going through right now at the international level, at the national level. And I'm going to try to synthesize this succinctly because I'm still threading things through. But here in Los Angeles, we have hotspots of unhoused communities, racialized unhoused communities that have a higher levels of use of drugs such as methamphetamines, crack, opioids, where there are neighborhoods that are seeing fatal opioid overdose, fentanyl overdoses at higher rates. And so I've been thinking a lot about whether the process, the reconsideration that the coca plant is going through at the level of the World Health Organization that was called upon by Bolivia and that is being supported by Colombia's current government. So there's this big block of nations that have majority of indigenous people, or a significant population. A part of the national population is indigenous and has an ancestral relationship with the coca plant of traditional uses. And I'm super curious about whether there will ever be a possibility and a pathway to support people to have the option of continuing their consumption of substances in the current way that they do, but that they would have the option to experience use of of plants from which the synthesized substance is derived from. I have a hope that one day folks have the option of experiencing the alternative settings of the coca plant. For example, for crack users here in people who use crack here in Los Angeles, I would dream of the opportunity for folks to consume coca in a traditional setting here in Los Angeles and to learn about traditional uses from folks from Colombia, from Bolivia. And so I think that's like what I want to see from human rights movements, public health movements that are advocating for people who use drugs to have autonomy and for harm reduction health to be rooted in human rights and compassion and evidence-based practices. I want to see options for quote unquote recovery or well-briety, what I've heard Indigenous people call like, it's not quite sobriety, it's well-briety, it's whatever feels well for you. So it's an alternative view on what wellness looks like on the spectrum or continuum of substance use and quote unquote sobriety. But I would love for folks to have options to consume substances, psychoactive substances in traditional settings and to receive information. And if that guides people to making modifications in their consumption or use, that's a way forward, I think, for body autonomy that I want to put out there. So I'll just pause now and I'll turn it over to Izzy. Happy to talk about sexual body autonomy, but I'll pause there for now.
Well, I can also, I'll say maybe just a couple more words on that and appreciate you setting that up, Paula. And we'll probably not speak so much on the topic of decolonizing sex work just because that's less my kind of personal area of focus, professionally speaking, I guess you could say. And yeah, maybe 2 or 3 responses to what you were saying. So to your first question, Justice, which is like, what does decolonizing mean? I mean, a lot of people have a lot of different perspectives. I think that it's starting to kind of coalesce into a general sense of either backing out away from societal elements that have been developed by or shaped by kind of the modern colonial post-industrial order, and or not just like pulling away from that, but also I think recognizing that the world we're in now is different from the world that we were in 100, 500, 50, 100, 500 years ago, that there's this invitation or this sort of magnetism towards something new and different that we're being pulled toward, um, which is not just this idea of something, deconstructing something, but something, kind of moving toward and recalibrating and cohering something going forward. So in a practical, maybe one practical way I'll say is, I appreciate the example you gave, Paula, around coca, because it's true. There's been kind of a funnel. You maybe can see a story where the drug trade, as it was known for a very long time, was based on the kind of production and synthesis or production and extraction of raw materials into a product that was then kind of pushed out through various economic mechanisms, some legal and above ground, and some underground and criminalized. And that has led to this sort of kind of what I was saying earlier. I think it's sort of a contradictory scheme of drug control, you might say. And as we look at, I think a lot of people would look back at or look at the kind of current day, quote unquote, war on drugs and say, that's not really working anymore. That's an increasingly bipartisan and multi-demographic reality, which is great. Okay, we're all kind of looking at the same thing. We got to do it differently. And then we look forward, and everyone sort of has a different opinion about what we do next, because I think that's a little bit harder to sort out. And part of what I think Paula and I were trying to get to with the chapter and with the prayer and with the way that we were approaching the whole conversation about drugs in particular, is one that has more of this sort of magnetic future facing or future pulling vision that gives us at least like some of the groundwork for what that next phase might look like. Um, and just some examples, I would totally recommend people taking a look at the book and reading it if they have a lot of have more curiosity. But basically, kind of to your point, Paula, thinking about what are the ways through which the current reality, whether we like it or not, can still be adapted, or what elements from it can be composted or harvested into the future that we'd like to see, the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. And I mean, I think that probably we here and maybe people in the audience, maybe future watchers and people reading the book probably share some version of overlap there. We want a world that's more just, more compassionate, more responsive to people's actual needs. Like, is that decolonizing? Is that just good policy? Maybe that's a combination of both. And in my mind, specifically calling and responding to let's say, the more unsavory elements of modernity, um, like the separation between people and the seasons, or people and the natural tempo of the earth, the natural tempo of the way that we are supposed to live. Maybe we don't need to go back to only kind of living direct relationship to the land, but maybe we're sending too many emails. There's probably some middle ground here where it's not just like you pull fully back and out of this kind of contemporary order, because there's a lot of potential, I think, that is possible and maybe that needs to be pulled from and harnessed from the modern world in order to get to the next phase. When we're thinking about shifts in technology, our use of energy, healthcare, like these are things that demand engagement with kind of a modern world and a contemporary understanding. But how do we pull from those elements and have access to some of those elements while also recognizing that many of them were built out of the sort of like progress at any cost, um, urgency culture where like we got to be moving forward, we got to be moving forward. And I think that there's, like I said, there's probably somewhere in the middle there where it's not like the answer is to totally stop, because I think that's the fear that people have. It's like when people think, the more critical perspective is like, well, yes, there's all of these harms of colonization, and also look at the contemporary world we have. We have this and that, and all these things are only possible because of industrialization and so on. And I think that that's a longer conversation, but in my mind, the question around like how to weave together the benefits that have emerged from this kind of like modern era, while also recognizing like at what cost those have come, and is it possible to kind of unwind, pull out of that those like that pair between the story of progress and the cost of it, and like reweave some other narrative that allows us to be like, we actually are in a we are in a pluralistic world with a huge range of needs, demographic, ages, races, experiences, and like we all coexist whether we like it or not. We got to figure out a way to like be in this modernity, especially here in the global north in the United States. And what would it mean to, and is it possible to get from where we're at now, with the awareness that we can't go quite backwards or back into a future that like does consider the needs of all of those people, of all of the people that you were talking about, Paula, of the people that are most likely to fall through the gaps of the kind of contemporary order, you might say. So I guess that's a long way to say like trying to make the world a better place like everybody else, but we all have different visions, or somewhat different visions, for what that better way might be. So part of what I think we're trying to offer in this compilation, in this conversation is trying to offer, is that kind of, to your point, Justice, by orienting toward pleasure and justice and equity and compassion, that like maybe we can shape that thing together, shape that version of reality that we all want to live with, that we want our kids to live into, and so on and so on. So
I appreciate that.
we want our little cats to live into.
Yes, this is
Or the
Chula.
kitties.
She's she's playing with my earring. I also think there's so many different levels of that, and some, I think, where change feels possible is important to work, right? And that's why I love that folks can work at so many different levels, whether it be policy or mutual aid. And let's not forget that the revolution starts at home, right? And I think that that's important. And for me, I think it's been really interesting, right? Like I live in an area that is currently colonized. I live in Puerto Rico on Taino territory. And how to get free is a big conversation, right? And there's even if we were to be able to go right to the source and to reverse the insular acts, which create the status of a territory, that wouldn't change the condition of Puerto Rico right now. And so how can we create conditions where we can get free? And I think for me, that a really big part of that is addressing stigma, because I've seen, especially here, that even when we remove policing, stigma still exists. And Johan Hari, who wrote Chasing the Scream, looked at the research after Portugal decriminalized drugs, and it took a whole generation to
Right.
be able to start to see a reduction in stigma. And I think that being able to reduce stigma looks like collectivity, looks like people who are stigmatized being able to find community among each other and being able to work together. I think it also looks like resources. And I think especially when, I can answer the question of like, what does it look like to start to decolonize sex work in particular, is we have to understand that for many people, sex work is an economic activity. And so to be able to address economic needs and to be able to create safety, and the systems that we have in
Right.
place are not systems of safety, right? Like the criminal legal system is a punishment-based system, and it doesn't even do that well, right? But what we need is to be able to have resources, and that was really a lot of the indigenous way, is that we didn't really, our communities didn't really punish, but we just resourced and resourced and resourced, and to be able to support people who are enduring hard times, whether that looks like violence or whether that looks like poverty, and being able to find that among our own communities. And there are some concepts that we get to break down and explore together, concepts of ownership in relationship, and like ownership of body, whether that really being able to explore what it means to own our own bodies, and if we do, or how we might not own other people's. And so I think that these are times that are really bubbling up for us, and conversations that are really bubbling up for us as societies. And I do also want to point some of our listeners today to some of the prompts that we have created to help our readers and our listeners to be able to digest some of these materials and have some of these conversations. And there is a reader's guide that we created, and I've been releasing every chapter's reader's guide on my Instagram, which is at Justice Rivera _rights. And it will be on my website, the whole guide, pretty soon, which is www.justicerivera_rights.com. And I really love some of the concepts for integration, some of the reflection questions that are in your all's article, and all of the articles really come along with some things to think about, because these are the conversations we need to be able to start to destigmatize, and to be able to start to do what it is on a community level we need to be able to get free, because there are those levels of trying to address the conditions under which we're living, and that's policy level, that's more meta, and then there's the conditions of what we need as a community to be okay together, to be safe together. And then there's the conditions of like our own self and our own families. And that's one thing that I've really been thinking about now that I have a family, is what it means to be able to extend compassion, extend ideas of non-punishment to my kids and in my family system.
Yeah. If I could just add one quick thing, I'll have to jump in just a minute, so I'll be leaving y'all with Justice and Paula to get into the Q&A. But just maybe one last thought before I jump on what you were saying, Justice. I really appreciate the framing that you just brought forward. I think that this, we talk a lot about and have been talking here, and this larger conversation. I think the big critique of it, of like, people being overly woke or this or that, is that it's like got this kind of ideological flavor to it. But I think what you just said is very critical, that it's not just ideology, it's actually about resourcing, which is actually really about like life and the possibility for life and safety and capacity. And the again, like just just weaving this all together, part of the reason why I think this conversation about substance use is specifically so interesting, and how it kind of it's a good example and way that this larger conversation is articulated, is because it has to do with like what are the things that people need to live a good life, and what happens when you don't have certain basics, like what people have to utilize to cope or to um, just to develop and maintain resilience for whatever it is that's coming at them. So I just want to kind of put that finer point on this idea that the lack of a cohesive, let's call it a safety net, or kind of really equitable distribution of resources in the current environment that we have, one that is partially possible because of our separation from each other, because of our separation from the earth, because of our separation from like what the actual carrying capacity of the earth or a community is. All I think is one really good practical way to look at what are we really trying to do here. It's really trying to better understand how resources can be distributed in service of life and the earth and so on. So I'll leave you guys with that for now. Thank you again for the invitation, and we'll catch up on the Q&A once this is released. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a great day, and thank you again for the invitation, for being here.
Thank you for joining us, Izzy.
Absolutely. Take care, y'all.
Yeah. Paula, before we move to Q&A, I wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts.
I would just say that in terms of body autonomy, when it comes to sexuality, I've had a journey of yeah, I think of realizing through my own experiences that we don't receive the, I mean, maybe some folks do now, but we don't receive consent education in our schooling from a young age in a systematic, structured way. And I'm curious about how things will continue to evolve. I'm now seeing many more organizations that are doing policy advocacy work to get consent education into school curriculums, and I'm very enlivened by that work. I think that there comes a time that we need to acknowledge that we are sexual beings. It's part of our human nature, while also acknowledging some folks identify as asexual, but not talking about it is not an option. Not talking about it, it's a human rights violation, I think. It's a denial of our human right to our sexuality. And so I think my journey and my experience as someone who identifies as a survivor, and has found empowerment in my expression of my sexuality through different mediums, I'm very interested in rites of passage and doing that from like I'm on an exploratory journey of seeing how I learn from my different ancestries, and I want to move towards developing cultural spaces so that young people and people of all ages can experience rites of passage, particularly around sexual empowerment, sexual expression, and to also pair that up with complementary consent education. So I think that's where I'm at when it comes to body autonomy and sexuality. I'm also on this journey where I learned so much from so many incredible sex workers and sex worker rights advocates in just continuing to fight for the right to perform this line of work and to be recognized in this spiritual and psychotherapeutic and embodied form of healing. And so just very much hoping and calling in for more recognition of the validity of sex work and for more safe working conditions for folks that that offer that line of healing. Yes.
Thank you. Aho. Awesome. Well, this has been a really fruitful conversation, and I want to leave time to answer some questions if anyone has any. And Peter, I saw you come back on the screen, so happy to turn it back over to you to do all those pieces.
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone. Now is a good time to drop your questions in. I would like maybe to begin with, well, maybe more of a comment than a question. You know, my introduction to this subject was through a woman by the name of Carol Queen, who was an activist here in San Francisco, who in the 90s and 2000s was very active in trying to kind of create bridges between people. And she would oftentimes do it through, you know, different methods, through throwing parties, through books. She had a kind of an institute of sexology that, you know, it got to reach sometimes people who, you know, might not initially have been receptive to some of the ideas that we're discussing here. And I'm just wondering, you know, for those who are going to be listening to this and who are in a position that say they're working for, you know, like, let's say they want to break out of something like academia and be more involved in experiential realms, say beginning to approach some of the work that Carol was doing. What are some of your thoughts about that, about, you know, the areas in which people can begin to create bridges, and sometimes with people who, you know, might even have voted for someone like Trump, but yet might be receptive to some of these ideas in their own lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best things to do, I mean, we live in an age where we have so much access to understanding what's around us, and I think that that's always the best first step, is to see who is doing things that are similar. And I'll say this, you know, I work as a consultant. I work as part of a consultant collective, and I think that one of perhaps the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we are more in an era where we can be more freelancers. We can do things on the side, right? And
Yeah.
so I think I encourage everyone to do that, to explore that part of themselves. And I think the best way to do that is first seeing who is doing that around you, and seeing where you might be able to create your niche, but also to connect to those people so that you have that community and you can understand, you know, what are maybe some of the barriers, what are some of the things that you're going to need. I think some of the hard thing about even trying to do something like sexual health education these days is that a lot of the restrictions that apply to the sex trade also apply to trying to do sexual education. So we have Visa and MasterCard restrictions. Being able to post on apps or advertising can be very hard. And so really just understanding that, understanding how to work, understanding the words you can and cannot use. And then I think the best way to do that is within community. But I love, especially Gen Z is like on TikTok and doing it, right? And then we have whole new ways of being able to spell sex and like get around some of the algorithms. And I think that there are emerging ways that people can be able to explore these parts of themselves and to get themselves into that space as someone who's doing that. And I personally encourage everyone to do that intentionally, right? Because I think we all have a space there.
Yeah. Paula, did you have any thoughts about this?
Yeah, so yeah, and I'm also seeing Deborah's question in the chat. So for me, I think something that feels really important to tie together is how body autonomy relates to our environment and our and food sovereignty. I've learned over the past few years that for me, food justice and food sovereignty is really connected, because how we treat the earth, how we treat each other, for example, farm workers, in how we treat immigrants who come here as farm workers, predominantly indigenous folks, it all comes back to this lens of domination and subordination through which we can think of body autonomy, because body autonomy seeks to be emancipated from this paradigm of domination and subordination. So it comes back to food justice, because we all eat food. We all need clean drinking water. We all need clean air. These are things that are universal. And so when thinking about people that I don't agree with on some things that feel really fundamental, I think I need to bring it back to something that is universal, that is less controversial than some things that might be related to sexual diversity, sexual expression. So for me, it's really like, well, we really need to think about how we treat other human beings that we are not interdependent with. We're actually in an unhealthy codependent relationship because of the way that we've forced relations through the current agricultural system. And so that's one way, bringing it back to food, bringing it back to water quality, air quality. Something else I'm really trying to allow to guide me more is love. Sometimes love, it's a really beautiful thing. It's infinite, but sometimes it can be really difficult. So I think I'm really turning to love in the mysterious sense of like, please guide us for the things that we might fear. I like to always put up the mirror when it comes to love with a particular family member who has intolerant beliefs, and I just always remind her, yo, you're Christian. What about Jesus's teachings? And so I always try to sometimes put a little bit of trickster in there of bring, if someone's like a religious fundamentalist, I always try to bring it back to like, what did we learn from Jesus then? Like, what did Jesus teach us? So I think that's kind of how I go about it. But when it comes to sexuality for me, I have to think a little bit more, but I try to make metaphors. I try to bring it back to love. And I think at the end of the day, like a lot of people, we need oxytocin. So sometimes breaking it down, we need oxytocin, we need hugs. Touch has a healing element to it. And sometimes the love that is absent in our lives, say in childhood, throughout our life, we crave it in ways that we don't even know we need it. And so that can manifest into other ways of relating. So just bringing it back to those core human needs that sometimes get overlooked. I hope that was helpful, and I hope it inspires other folks on there.
Yeah, I love what you said about Jesus, because, who did Jesus hang out with anyways? Some of his closest friends were sex workers. So, let's see. So Deborah says, thank you for helping to build a new culture that embraces emerging values for social justice and health of the whole. How does one create a new model to make the current stigma/model of society obsolete? What do you see the role of collectives in that effort?
I definitely think there is a role that the publishing industry has to play. And I think in general, just being able to make knowledge widely accessible. And I think that's the biggest way to be able to help people receive information about what it is that they know or don't know, right? And I think that's the biggest thing. And actually one of the things that led to me even publishing this collection was that I received a fellowship that previously I'd been a finalist for in an advocacy category twice before. And I realized that I was trying to do an advocacy project to use a drug policy reform mechanism to create the same reform in the sex trade, but that ideological shift hadn't happened yet and on a widespread level. And so how do we create that ideological shift? And so I think that we need to create ways to be able to share information and spread knowledge, and we need to be able to do so in ways that it's not being censored. And that's very, very hard today, like, right? That censorship is happening every step of the way. And so, but we have emerging technologies and we have old school technologies. I see people making a lot of zines right now, and I think that's amazing, right? I love zines. And so I think that there's that role to play. And I think collectives play a huge role in being able to disseminate information. Unfortunately, so do algorithms, right? And so, so I think that there's, different models of this, but I also think kind of a lot of what Paola was saying is I think frameworks can be really helpful, being able to come back to something like love or whatever, or body autonomy framework, and be able to have ways in which we explain things to people that can be really helpful. And I think in some ways it's also just, it's generational. Like, again, I live in Puerto Rico. We had a historic election that honestly was robbed from us a couple of weeks ago. But, like I think for the first time ever since colonization, we have an emerging independence party that should have won and is going to win soon. And that is because of the youth. That is because the youth see what's up, and they're not afraid of the things that my abuelo was afraid of and that my generation left for. Like, they're here. And I think that it's really being able to invest in them and their growth, because I think that there is there's an emerging wave that we can ride, right, of emerging power, because I think that old paradigm is on its way out.
Paula?
Yeah, I'll say from my end, I currently work at an organization that grew out of the ACT UP movement, the early HIV AIDS response, when the government was not taking action to meet the needs of folks that were dying from AIDS. And so today we offer trainings to service providers across LA County in overdose response, overdose prevention. And we also have a training to support county service providers, folks that are case managers, outreach workers, in building their capacity to work to support folks who are street-based sex workers who use drugs, unhoused people who use drugs. And so something that we've worked into the training is actually unpacking the etymology of stigma. And I think that has been a very informative experience to be in that relationship with folks, and unpacking that stigma comes from stigmata. It comes from this punishment of social branding and punishing someone by, like, in antiquity, burning people with marks, with metal rods, and how that also happened in context of enslavement. And so then bringing that back to present day, where social branding happens when we cast judgment from perception. So with our sight and with our attitudes, our judgments, and our beliefs. And so then going on this whole arc throughout the training and in different trainings to, like, support folks in becoming self-aware of when that stigma comes up, and how that's participating and continuing this practice of social branding or casting people into certain categories because of the beliefs we were raised with. So I'll leave it at that. But I think the role of popular education is really important, doing teach-ins. And we don't need to rely on funded structures, nonprofits to do this. We can educate each other in autonomous spaces any day, anytime.
And I think we have time for one more question. Somebody from CPEM Project says, Hotep, how does the text address moving away from calling or naming sex workers derogatory terms like whore, prostitute, streetwalker, and the like, which denotes a degree of profiling and believing that beautiful people are substandard to the rest of society?
Absolutely, it does. In fact, the first article, Basic Mechanics of the Sex Trade, talks about actually the origin of the term sex worker, which is Carol Lee in San Francisco, who really coined that term, and that prostitution is a charge people are given. It's a term that exists from, solely in a criminal legal context that then has been used and weaponized against people. But it's really pervasive. And I mean, it's really hard for me when I still see, like hooker jokes that are being told, and in fact, dead hooker jokes that are being told on Netflix, example, or etc., right? And I see that on Amazon, all of this, and the fact that we are, we've come a far way, right? A lot of things that I watched and liked when I was younger, I go to show my stepson who's 15, and I'm like, oh, that did not age well. Like, I didn't even remember, how anti-trans or something that was, but that we're in an age now in 2014 or 2024 where it's still okay to tell these types of jokes. And so really talking about the types of words that we can use to be able to help empower people. So sex worker, people in the sex trade, people in the sex industry, erotic professional, these are all terms that are really people first, and recognize the labor and the work that people are doing. That article also talks about how many people might not see themselves as sex workers. And so to call them such might be something that immediately makes them really defensive. And that goes back to a lot of the conversations we've been having about stigma. And also, if we're in a social service context, that many people do try to reclaim some of those words that could be demeaning and call themselves that. And although we do want to reflect people's language, how we might want to say, is it okay if I call you this? It kind of feels weird from my standpoint to call you what you're calling yourself, but I understand that's what you do. And so there's a pretty broad discussion of that in that particular chapter. So I'd like to point you towards that, which is pretty much Reframe Health and Justice's introduction to sex worker centered harm reduction in a chapter.
Paula, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we talk about this. I know that other folks cover it in the book. I think this is something that also gets covered in some of the trainings I deliver here in LA, but I can't speak to it in the chapter in the book. But I know that there are ample folks that write on sex work in the anthology that do move away from this language and use more empowering language. And also some folks have reclaimed language within their communities. And so I think some of the work is to distinguish when certain terminology is reclaimed and who gets to reclaim it, and supporting folks to reclaim it, but also understanding that that doesn't mean that folks from outside of the community can use that terminology unless they are invited to. But I think those circumstances are quite rare and sacred. So you might hear that someday is International Whores Day, or some folks might consider themselves a sacred hoe, but that doesn't mean that folks from outside of the community can regard to folks in that way.
Yeah. Well, we have more questions coming through the chat, but I think we have essentially run out of time. So, Justice, any final thoughts before we part?
Yeah, I mean, that's just, I see some of the questions here, and I'll say, yes, the book talks about this. Also, the introduction talks about what we don't talk about. And so we allude to some of the things that are happening in other countries. It is mostly a US context, but we have resources that we point to as well. And I think one of the best resources to look for things that are happening outside of the country is Revolting Prostitutes by Juno Mack is a really amazing book. And so I'd look at that. But I think one of the amazing things that our book does that no one else's does is we look at what sex work policy reform can be and is, like all the way up to and including and past decrim, including anti-criminalization and going even farther. And so we really create a huge continuum of that. And so I really appreciate folks coming. If anyone is San Juan based, we actually are having an in-person reading in Caguas that's happening on Friday the 20th. Please head to my Instagram to see more about that. I'm hoping early next year we're going to have hopefully an LA reading, so not too far from you all. It's really amazing to have some of these virtual events too, and really excited that this is going to be on YouTube. I will say one of the biggest things, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for purchasing our book. We also really, really appreciate Amazon and Goodreads reviews. That's something we're really looking for right now. So if you like what we're doing, if you want to keep following us, please just head to Amazon or Goodreads and review our book. An honest review. That's all we really need. So thank you so much.
Well, it has been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for gracing our virtual halls, Justice and Paula, and of course, I think Izzy already left, but it's been an honor having you here. And we thank you for all your good work. I would also like to thank our friends at Synergetic Press, which we've had many, many fruitful and wonderful collaborations over the years. A big shout out to Fernanda for all her efforts in making today happen. Also to Jasmine for getting the ball rolling. And of course, to our dear friend, Deborah Parrish-Snyder, the publisher of Synergetic, in honor of many years of friendship. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for joining us today. So today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, publishing program, and educational outreach are all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everyone. Be well, be kind to each other. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much for having us. Take care, everyone.